Hey, Saretsky here. As always, this is the Canadian real estate market update with particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value and entertainment out of these videos, all I ask you to hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. I want to touch this week on the elephant in the room and then get to some Canadian housing updates, some things that I'm looking at, things that I'm seeing. But I want to talk about the elephant in the room because it kind of sets up the framework, which is US CPI inflation just coming in at 7.9% this past week. So it's the highest print in over 40 years. As you guys know, this has been a key theme of these videos for quite some time now, is the inflation story, but more so the debasement story. US CPI inflation, again, I think as we can all agree, probably underreported, and Stats Canada is actually even worse. We'll get that data in the next couple of weeks for Canada. But let's just look at some of the US numbers on a year-over-year basis. You know, used car prices up 41%, gasoline up 38%, meat, fish, eggs plus 13%, food at home plus 8.6%, food away from home plus 0.8%, shelter up 4.7%. So you can have a good laugh there because if you're not following U.S. home prices, the Case-Shiller Index, which measures national home prices in the U.S., is up over 20% year over year, and the rental market is booming in the U.S. So again, that's underreporting. So regardless of how you look at it, the true measure of inflation today is, again, hovering in the double digits. And so this is creating a very interesting predicament because, again, rightfully or wrongly, everyone is now saying, okay, well, you know, traditional central bank policy, you know, you are inflation fighters, that, you know, inflation up, interest rates must go up. Inflation up, interest rates must go up. That's just like, people are so fixated on that without looking at the bigger picture, which is, let's look at the central banker's dilemma. Again, rightly or wrongly, whatever you think is the moral thing that they should do, the current system, so not one individual, but the global system, the global financial picture is global debt to GDP is at 365%. You have a situation where, because private debt load, so every sort of financial crisis that happens, which is any financial crisis is almost always created through high levels of private debt. Because at the end of the day, if you think about it, private debt, so corporations and households, they can't really issue, you know, a household can't issue a bond and say, hey, we'll pay you later, and then ultimately have that bond, you know, funded by the central bank, because the government can basically print currency, right? The government can basically just issue debt, print the money, and say, we'll pay it later. So private sector doesn't have that ability. So every sort of financial crisis happens when you get too much debt in the private sector. They're not able to then roll that debt over, and you have a wave of insolvencies. And so this is kind of the dilemma that we're at today. We're like, okay, well, inflation is starting to bite. Wages aren't keeping up with that inflation. And now the solution is, well, in order to fix this solution, let's raise their debt servicing interest payments. Well, how is that going to help them? So basically, let's just understand this very, very clearly. The current dilemma, the current decision that the central bankers have to make, they're sitting in the chair here, and they can push one button or two buttons. Button number one is let inflation run as it is, or just mildly fight it, and hopefully that you know, you can have all this debt that's accumulated in the system over, you know, decades slowly be evaporated or eroded through basically debasement through inflation. Or you can tame inflation, so you can decide to fight the inflation, and by doing so, the only way to do that is basically to induce a recession. So you have to kill demand. You have to kill demand in the economy, and the only way to do that is by raising rates significantly enough where you can induce a consumer-led recession, which kills spending and alleviates some of the inflationary pressures. Again, keep that in mind, that it alleviates some of the inflationary pressures, because a lot of the inflationary pressures which are now building are because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. When you have some of the two larger, you know, commodity-based economies basically being shut off to the world, we have a picture that is unfolding today, which is rampant increases in gas prices, rampant increases in commodity prices. I mean, all you have to do is look at the chart here of commodity, the agricultural index here. You can see ag prices, roofing. And so these central bankers, by fighting inflation through inducing a recession, isn't necessarily going to mean that inflation is going to go back down to 2%. So this is kind of just understand that this is the current policy dilemma. And this is also what Zoltan Polzar of Credit Suisse. Keep in mind, the Zoltan is considered one of the most brilliant people in the financial world. He is considered basically the doctor or specialist in financial plumbing. And so he's basically called every sort of repo crisis that's happened. And so basically what he's calling now, he's just titled a piece called the Bretton Woods III, which is basically a reworking or a rewriting of the global sort of financial system, the monetary base as we know it, right? The US dollar is a global reserve currency. And so what he basically argued in that paper, which is kind of what we've been talking about in these videos for the last 6 to 12 months, was this is the largest currency debasement. You're seeing these fiat currencies by governments basically like melting ice cubes, or think of a melting ice cube in your hand. That's kind of what's happening to the purchasing power of these currencies, because they're being debased at such a rapid pace. And so ultimately, commodities are the true sort of picture of the value of the currency, right? If you think about it in very simple terms, I mean, at the end of the day, a fiat currency is just an obligation of a government, right? It's just an obligation. It's a liability of the government. What is real, what is tangible is hard assets, it's currencies, because you need those to actually live. Like you can trade those, you can barter those. And so he's basically arguing that the monetary system is going to change significantly. We're going to go to some point or another, some sort of reset, and that could look like some sort of backing of these fiat currencies, because that's ultimately what's going to be needed to stop this commodity push inflation that he's talking about. So if that sort of is maybe over your head, if I need to sort of explain that a little bit in simpler terms, basically you have commodity inflation, which looks like it's going to be sustained into the future. We have this sort of de-globalization, global supply chains are breaking down. We have this reshoring of global supply chains, so we'll see more domestic manufacturing, et cetera, in Canada. And so that's structurally a little bit more inflationary moving forward. That ultimately it's going to be difficult to get inflation back down to 2%, regardless of what central bankers do, because central bankers are basically beholden to financial markets, and by raising interest rates thus too far, you basically trigger this debt bomb that has been lingering for years. I mean, if you think about it, we've basically been on life support for the last 13 plus years with running zero interest rates and massive quantitative easing. And so there is not really any repairing this system. And so by raising rates, you do detonate this bomb. So keep that in mind as I sort of elude and switch course here to the Canadian real estate picture, because what you're starting to see is the two markets in Canada which were undervalued, left for the sort of the graveyard, was the Alberta housing market and the housing market in Saskatchewan, because really like the commodity space was pretty beat up over the previous 5, 6, 7 years. Is that we're now seeing this resurgence and this structural impairment in the commodity space, that these two markets are actually going to benefit. So if you look at RBC's chart here, they're predicting real GDP growth for 2022. The top two provinces are Alberta and Saskatchewan. So that's a complete shift from what we're obviously all used to, and hence my bullish view that has been on the Alberta market, because I think structurally now you've got oil prices where companies have been told not to reinvest. They've been told not to add to more supply. They've been told to divest future exploration in the oil and gas sector. And so we're now seeing the result of some of these policies combined with a war in Russia, which is the major exporter of the oil, that you've got a comeback to life moment in Alberta. So keep in mind that the province of Alberta, in their budget, they budgeted based on their, their fiscal budget there. They budgeted $70 US oil. I mean, we're well north of $100. In fact, in Canadian dollar terms, oil prices are now at all-time new record highs in Canadian dollar terms. Now, keep in mind, the Canadian dollar hasn't quite kept pace with the recent growth in the oil prices. So there's been some sort of delinkage there more recently. But this is structurally very bullish for the Alberta housing market. I can tell you, as someone that's actively looking day to day, any sort of decent building lot in the inner city there, which is pretty much what I've been looking for, any decent building lot is sold in one day. Every day, all day, every day, one day on market sold, which was unheard of, because before you can kind of go in, take your time, throw conditions on a month later. So it is boom town in cow town right now. And again, for you guys that I know I've had a lot of people reaching out to me, if you want to discuss Calgary, Alberta real estate, feel free to send me an email at steve@stevesaretsky.com. I'm always happy to chat. I can connect you with my connections over in Calgary if that's something that you want to do. I'm still bullish on that market, and see people go, oh, it's a bubble in Calgary. Look at the prices; they're up. Inner city lots are up 20% over the past 12 months. I mean, let me just zoom things out here. Look at this is the Calgary Home Price Index. I mean, for the most part, basically flat. We've had some peaks and valleys here, but for the most part, you've had really almost no growth for the past decade plus in that market. So the fact that it's now moved 20% in 12 months, sure, it's a fast pace of growth, but on a relative basis, when we zoom out, I think we have to contextualize here that there's properties in Vancouver and the Greater Toronto suburbs that have doubled. They have doubled in 24 months. So I don't know what everyone's getting so worried about Calgary housing market for. The affordability metrics are extremely positive. But that leads me to the next discussion, which again is Saskatchewan real estate. Again, will tend to benefit from the commodity boom in agriculture, in wheat, in the wheat sector. We've obviously seen wheat prices grow exponentially over the past 3-4 months. People are talking about, people much smarter than I am, talking about food crises in parts of the world by the end of Q4 of 2022. So you've got all of this developing, and you're going, okay, well, where's all this rich commodities? Where's all the food being grown? You've got mass swaths of farmland in Saskatchewan that are just ripe for the picking. I mean, that's your food-based source to feed your population. If you can't feed your population, you will have social unrest. So I think that those two markets are poised for setup. I mean, there's no surprise why hedge funds in the U.S. are plowing money into Saskatchewan farmland. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Bill Gates has been buying it up for the last 18 months. I mean, these people aren't stupid. They were just ahead of the curve, seeing what sort of the writing on the wall was. And so that's kind of where things are at today. That's kind of my focus on right now, things that I'm looking at. I think that the world is changing very, very drastically. We've talked about it on the show before. This is going to be a major shift in geopolitics, in monetary policy. I think that we're clearly seeing the people that are tuned in, hopefully watching the show, are putting themselves in good positions to succeed, or at least to maintain their net worth. And we're seeing, unfortunately, a good part of society that has no idea what is going on, that cannot explain or figure out why gas prices, besides Putin, are up at $2.20 a liter here in the Lower Mainland, that unfortunately are falling further and further behind. So obviously, for the show's purposes, I hope that you can share this video to at least one friend or family member, so we can get them set up here on the right path. Just about understanding the bigger picture, right? Like, I don't necessarily have to give you guys investment advice, but just understand, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, just understand the two policy levers that central banks currently have. They have two levers. They have two levers right now. That's all you have to understand. The decision that will be made over the coming 12 months will be fight inflation by raising interest rates and inducing a recession, which, again, net will hurt a decent portion of society, or don't quite fight inflation, and you still hurt society because there will be a good portion of society that doesn't have hard assets that gets impacted by their loss of purchasing power. So those are the two decisions that are facing us today. And either way, there will be winners and losers out of this. So I hope that frames things up for you. As always, we'll see you next week.